Have you ever wondered why, despite all the talk about neurodiversity, we still struggle to include neurodivergent individuals in the workplace? Is it possible that the so-called normal way of doing things isn't really the best way at all? In our latest episode, I sit down with Weslie Ricks to discuss how neuro-inclusive leadership benefits everyone, and we tackle the delicate balance of self-advocacy in a world that's not yet fully disability accepting. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad for you to join us today. We're going to discuss how we can create more gateways to neurodivergent employment. And we'll do this by thinking differently about how we view and assess potential talent. With us today is Weslie Ricks. So excited. She has a varied career working with top technology companies and supporting neurodivergent job seekers to help them navigate the maze to gainful employment. She currently leads global neurodiversity programs and works directly with neurodivergent and disabled individuals to help them be prepared for success in the workplace. Thank you for joining us today, Weslie, and welcome. I'm so glad you're with us.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And I always like to start from the beginning. Like, I know who you are, but you may be new to some of the audience. And I thought maybe we'd start by you sharing a bit about your background and how you got to supporting neurodivergent and disabled individuals.
Yeah, I have an interesting background. I feel like a lot of people in this space have a personal connection to the work, and I'm no different. I am neurodivergent in terms of I have pretty severe OCD and anxiety, and I am a mother to 3 autistic children, and my daughter also has a hearing impairment. So disability work isn't, just one aspect of my life. It's all encompassing for every aspect of my life. And I actually used to be a group therapist for sex offenders, which, a lot of people have initial reactions to. But that work, a big part of it was helping ensure that the sex offenders had, upon release, gainful employment and a stable place to live. Because if they don't, their risk of reoffending skyrockets. And so it was a big challenge trying to coach them and work with other companies on, being willing to hire felons. And in that process, I realized if I could make a difference on this community getting employment, why can I not make a difference on a community that I'm so passionate about, being people with disabilities, people who are neurodivergent? So I went back, got my master's at USC, go Trojans. And a lot of my work was focused on neurodiversity as a competitive advantage. And I've now been able to work at technology companies, leading global disability initiatives, not just hiring, but also how do we actually support that talent once they're through the door? And then I have my consulting business to, educate companies on what a neuro-inclusive workplace looks like, and also just help the job seekers themselves on that maze of, a job interview. What are the unwritten rules? What are all the things that that you need to know to be successful in that? So that's kind of high level, but really ultimately just my biggest motivation for my work is my kids and making sure that the workplace is different by the time they're in it.
And I like how you were in a challenging role for a lot of reasons, right? Societal obstacles, obviously having empathy for an formerly incarcerated individual, getting them employment, and then how you took those skills, right? And thinking about how you create gateways to employment, how you create pathways to understanding for employers to accept individuals that maybe weren't on their talent pipeline, using a little jargon there. And then you looked at your family and your experiences and you're like, there is this other population and I have these skills to like break barriers to employment, and you flip that. And I just absolutely love that. When you first started and you segued to focusing on neurodiversity in the workplace, where did you start? Was it more in like disability accommodations, or did you start really from the beginning of the talent management pipeline of, I have experience as a placement person and like working at the placement? Like, how did you really segue into like who you are today? Because now you're doing coaching and like, these big initiatives, but how did you start? Because I think sometimes when I think about where I started and, I'm interested in where you started, it might give folks who are listening an idea of like, where is like this natural learning point if I'm new on this journey?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And honestly, for a while, it didn't feel like it was a segue that I could make. It felt like a really big jump and something that, wasn't possible. But I decided to just kind of start where I was at. And I got involved in being a recruiter. And in that capacity as being a recruiter, I then started doing just some advocacy for myself and those around me, and then picking up more and more projects. And then that led to kind of my more formal role now. But what I saw as a recruiter was just so many barriers for employment, so many, hiring managers and interview teams that were focused on culture fit, and not culture fit that's correct as in, does this person align to our organizational values? I'm talking the culture fit that it's turned to, do I want to have a beer with this person? Do I have a lot in common with this person? Do I like this person? I've seen, rhetoric around, you need to make eye contact in interviews. You need to, do all of these different things. And being on the recruiting side, I just quickly realized, wow, people like my children, honestly, people like me are not going to be able to make it through this process without masking. And then if you mask through the process, you start the job and you have two choices. You can either continue masking, which will lead to severe burnout, or you can then disclose, and there's a huge fear of retaliation and discrimination. So it started with the hiring, and then I recognized this can't just be the focus. We have to ensure that we have the accommodations in place. We have sites that are ready and accessible. We have managers who are trained, and eventually moved into kind of the end-to-end journey of disabled talent and what supports are needed.
When you were talking about the masking or, the need to make eye contact, I'm going back in time a bit for myself, but I remember how much I used to love telephone interviews and would find that once it became to the in-person interview, that's when things started to get botched up a bit. Because if they can't see you, you could look at your notes, you could be looking at the wall, right? It didn't take all the barriers and anxiety out of it, but you could, right? If they can't see you, right? You can prep a bit. And I remember how much easier those like I call them the first round interviews and second round interviews would be, because you could have your notes and they'd ask you a question and you could kind of look at your notes, and then you have to go to those final interviews. And that's when they're like really testing the human, right? Like, how do you respond? Not what are you saying? And then you mentioned having anxiety. And I think it can be crippling sometimes, because sometimes I feel like interviews, and I know this is why like autistic individuals specifically, but other neurodivergent folks, especially those of us that have anxiety, want the questions in advance, because sometimes they put a question that puts you on the spot, and it's not because you couldn't answer it, but the way it's phrased, it like heightens your anxiety and adrenaline, and then you flub through it.
Completely.
I'm guessing you've experienced things like that, or you've worked with people like that. How do you help employers to realize that it's what's being said, not how it's necessarily being said, that they really need to focus on when the normative view is like, would I go drink a beer, as you would say?
Yeah, definitely. It's a challenge, which I'm sure you know as well, just kind of reframing for people, even what neurodiversity is, what autism is, how that's completely different per person, because a lot of people have these preconceived notions about specific diagnoses and capabilities. And so for me, it really starts, at the education level to start.
So really kind of thinking about one of the big barriers, I think, is like the anxiety of the interview, and interviewers or hiring managers thinking like they need to have those questions that really put people on the spot, right? I think that sometimes is the make or break moment when somebody says, tell me of a time you did this, and it just completely freezes the person because they're not willing to give the questions in advance. How do you help them understand that it's the quality, like what Weslie and Theresa are saying in response to the question, not how they're responding? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the biggest thing, first of all, is starting at the educational level. So with hiring managers, do they even know, what neurodiversity is? Do they know maybe how somebody who's neurodivergent could present in an interview? So starting with that educational level for them. And then really what I've encouraged all of the leaders I've ever worked with is to just focus on skills-based assessments. Focus on the core skills of the roles. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people where they have a long list of all the things you need for the role. And as we actually dissect it a little more, it turns out only a third of that list was really required for the role. The manager just would like to see somebody who is, a people person or is really good at presenting, but it's not even necessary for this, software engineer type role. And so really breaking that down with them and moving to a skills-based assessment, what that's looked like for some of the individuals that I've worked with is, an Excel document of, you need to sort this data and find for me, these percentages and make a pivot table. That's very clear what you need a person to do. But when you're giving all of these hypotheticals and, just out there questions, it can be really hard for people who are neurodivergent to know how to answer. And to your point, there's the anxiety aspect. I only a couple months ago had an anxiety attack on a call with someone. And I had to, in the middle of the call, tell them that I needed to drop. And then there's anxiety that comes after the fact of, oh, how did I present? What are they going to think of me? So really just being proactive upfront in designing an inclusive interview process that is taking out all of that behavioral aspect that's unnecessary and culture fit aspect, I think is the most important coaching you can give to hiring managers.
And I think that it's an interesting thing. I've had conversations with leaders too, where it's like, what are the core skills of the job? And sometimes they'll say, well, they have to be able to communicate well and they have to, run interpersonal relationships. And you're looking at the job and it's like an accounting role. And I'm like, well, I understand they do that today, but why can't it be broken apart? And sometimes you get the pushback of, well, that's how we do things. And so one of the things I try to help folks work through is maybe that's how we do it today. Or maybe we created these huge job roles because we had so many people in the talent pipeline, so you had to find exclusion criteria. But now we're saying we don't have enough talent. So why can't we think about jobs differently? And so I like to hear that you're having success in that area.
Yeah, I just to add on to that really quick, I agree with that. I focus on job carving a lot. I've had roles before where, they want to hire, somebody new to the team. They want to be inclusive, but they want them to speak 3 languages and know all of these analytics tools and things like that. And there have been several instances where we've been able to job carve and say, okay, maybe we have one person who does these things because they speak those languages and they have that skill set. We create an entirely new role for this person to handle something else, and they could take some of the work off of that individual's plate. So it's possible, but to your point, so many leaders have tunnel vision a little bit in this aspect where they only want to focus on what they've done in the past.
Right. Or they focus on like replacing the person and not like, so somebody leaves and they're replacing a specific person and not really looking at the skills allocation on the team and thinking about where's really the gap in terms of what the team needs now that the person's gone. So I think it's really interesting. And philosophically, when we talk to leaders, I think you'll agree with this. When we talk about skills-based assessments, they agree. But then when you start getting them to try to apply it, that's where I see that there's some sort of pushback. What do you think? I mean, we talked about education, but what do you think it really would take for like leaders to see this more at scale? Like one of the things I've been trying to get leaders to think about is we talk about teams, but do we think about teams like we do in sports? So that's the analogy I've been using. What other things have you seen that really help somebody that may be stuck? They're like, I want to do the right thing, but this is how we work here. What are some other things you've done to help shift like culture and mindset to like, we can work differently and it doesn't have to cost more and we can still be effective?
Yeah, I love that because that's a huge focus that I have with leaders is you're not about to hire your first neurodivergent person. Like you likely have someone on your team today who's neurodivergent or may have some other form of disability or invisible disability. And so we're not even forward looking. You can implement things right now that will make your team more neuro-inclusive. And I know you know the research, but a lot of hiring managers who implement, these type of trainings and processes in their teams that are supposed to be for people who are neurodivergent, they actually get feedback from all of their employees that they prefer the working style. So I usually like to start with where the team is at. There's, various trainings that we offer, but also skills to show the manager, to your point, this isn't going to make your life harder. It actually could make your life easier. So I'll give one example. I have this kickoff form that I just recommend every manager use with their employees right when they start, any employee. The manager fills out one side, the employee fills out another, and they're just high-level questions up front, like tell me a little about yourself, where are you from? Where do you want your career to go? And then it gets more specific, like what are your communication preferences? How often do you want to meet? Do you prefer private or public praise? And every manager that I have had use this not only uses it with their neurodivergent employees, but all of their employees, and they're able to keep it to remember how to work most effectively with those people. And then their teammates start using the tool with each other. And what it leads to is a more inclusive environment and higher productivity because people actually know how to work together in a neurodiverse team. So I like to just really tell hiring managers that it's not as big of a lift as you think it is. It actually could make your managing of your entire team easier due to clearer communication, more inclusive practices, more often getting feedback. And once we're kind of able to break down some of those preconceived notions, they seem to buy in more. And we've gotten a lot of really positive feedback. So that's kind of been my main approach when there's hesitancy to adopt some of these best practices.
And what I really like is when leaders actually see that, oh, this is actually benefiting the entire team.
Yeah.
The other thing I really like that you were saying, and that I think I really want to double down on for the audience listening, is that these forms are not used to identify opportunities to change people. These forms are used to get a better sense of how individuals work and working ways and finding a mutual path forward to like accommodate those differences. And I raised that because there was a big push over the last about 2 decades for something they used to call leadership styles. And it was actually like a communication style exercise. And one of the things with that exercise, which was fun, is you would get to learn the different teams' exercises. But one of the more troubling components of it, from a neurodiversity perspective, or really just individual respect differences view, is that it would talk about how to flex to meet other styles. And I think where the pivot is coming and where I think your form works and where that format could work is not to change how you talk to people, but to be aware of how other people need to be talked to. It's like that platinum rule, treat people the way they need to be treated. So I think that these tools are really great when leaders get it and they go, okay, this is the preference or this is the need, and they work to accommodate that rather than learning about the team and going, okay, but this is how the rest of the team works, so you have to modify. So I just like to call that out to the audience that these forms work really good when we start going, oh, so we have somebody that's really fast and we have somebody that can throw a ball, like going to the team analogy. And this is a person that's good at catching and this is a person that's good at hitting. And you don't try to change those skills. You learn how to bring it all in.
Yeah. And I've had managers before completing the form with their teammates raise the concern of, well, what do I do if, I fill it out and my communication style and my needs are very different than the other person's? And to your point, it's not a battle of, how are we going to do this? First of all, I would say the onus is on the company and the manager to accommodate an employee. But there still is ways, if you have people who communicate differently, even just that knowledge is a gift so that people aren't taking things personally, when maybe somebody sends a message over setting up a meeting or any instance, really just understanding your teammates, what the strengths are, what people, don't prefer. For years, I was giving people public shout outs and they were uncomfortable. And I didn't realize that. And so just learning how even people like to receive praise is a gift so that you don't get yourself in uncomfortable situations.
Yeah, like I think about people who are very direct, and those are the best people to do executive summaries, right? And then people who like to go deep on details, they're the ones that should be writing the white papers, right? Like there's those skill sets can be aligned. And sometimes we're like, oh, well, you need to learn to be more brief in your communications. And then telling somebody else, so you need to go in more detail, when if you paired them, they'd make a beautiful team.
Yep.
I know that we've talked a lot about managers, but a lot of our audience is neurodivergent as well, or knows someone that's neurodivergent. And there's a lot of things. I spend a lot of time talking about the things employers need to do, because I think there's a huge onus on the employer to make these things work. But the truth is that's future state in the sense of more employers are getting it, but not employers are all there. So there are a lot of things I believe that neurodivergent individuals can also do to be more prepared to work in corporate environments. So what are some techniques and strategies that you find most effective in preparing neurodivergent individuals for job interviews, whether or not the company is known to be like disability friendly?
Yeah, that's a great call out, because I often struggle with this, right? Like everything you want to tell someone of, choose a disability inclusive organization or disclose, your disability to request accommodations. That isn't a perfect world where, everyone is inclusive, everyone's following the ADA or whatever their local regulations and guidelines are. And we're not there yet. So while I always do try to push for self-advocacy, I do agree with you that we have a lot of work to do on a societal and, corporate level to be more inclusive of people. But one of the biggest things that I do with the clients that I work with is just prepare them for what to expect. Like similar to, how I interact with my children, preparation for me and them is very important. I don't like last minute things. I don't like things that catch me off guard. So if I feel prepared and if they feel prepared for, a vacation we're going on, we know what to expect. We're all a lot more comfortable in that environment. So a lot of just practicing, role playing interviews, going through not even hypothetical situations that they'll likely encounter in the workplace. For example, I had a client who their manager basically told them, just submit 40 hours a week. I know you're doing that amount of work. You don't need to always be taking breaks, coming in and out. on your time card. Just go ahead and submit 40 hours a week. For the autistic individual, that was really hard for them to wrap their head around because they're like, well, I need to be accurately, putting in my time card. And they kept having this big back and forth. And so ultimately, I just was able to talk with that individual, explain maybe why I think their manager was doing what they were doing, but empower them to say, you know what, just push back on your manager. You're not comfortable with this situation. You can just tell them that you would like to submit the time cards accurately to the exact times that you're working. So really just walking through those situations with them at any point, if they have, questions about social situations at work, being invited to things that they don't want to go to, I'll get a call just, asking, how can I navigate this situation? And ultimately, they usually know the answer. They've just been in a disempowering environment, and being able to talk to somebody who can kind of unravel the situation with them, they're able to come to the conclusion themselves of what they think they should do.
And I think that's really nice to hear that you're saying they know what to do, but they're looking for that assurance that their approach is appropriate because you're saying they're not getting that support in the office. I know that there's always struggles, but there's always success stories. Do you have a specific story where you feel like your coaching just changed the trajectory of someone's career path, like where they were stuck, and how they were able to overcome those barriers?
Yeah, I have one that comes to mind that is really meaningful to me. I had a client come through my business who was neurodivergent and recently divorced and was not in a great marital situation. And then their work situation was not great either. They were working in higher ed at a location that was very intense about coming to the office, even though they were autistic and had some chronic health issues. And so they came to me essentially asking, like, how do I disclose and get accommodations in my current workplace? And we were able to uncover that really what they wanted was a new workplace. They just had spent so long there in an environment that wasn't neuro-inclusive that it had really lowered their confidence enough that when I would speak with her, some of her options were maybe corporate's just not for me. Maybe working is just not for me. I feel like I'm the problem. And so we worked together over the course of a couple months, and I didn't teach her anything new. It wasn't some magic thing that I did. It was just reinstalling her confidence and knowing that she is fully capable, but it was her environment that was mostly disabling her at this point. And she was able to apply for another role in the interview process. She requested accommodations, and those followed her into her employment. And so she has just been in a much more accommodating environment where she feels like she can show up as her full self to work and not have to mask, and can also advocate for herself. So that's one that comes to mind for me. But again, I just want to say that it was all her. It just was, when people are in disempowering environments for so long, it takes a toll on your mental health and on your confidence.
And right. And if every day you're going into an environment that's telling you you're not the right fit, or you're not working out, or you feel like you don't fit, I can imagine that would really take its toll. And then, like you said, she wasn't even certain if work was right for her anymore, right? And so I love that you were able to flip that around. And then it sounds like she found a very neurodiverse friendly employer, right? That she was able to disclose at the beginning. That's really awesome. We started for a bit at the beginning where we talked about your transition for where you started and then how your kids inspired your journey. And you did touch a bit that you said that hopefully you can create the future state before your kids get there. And on this podcast, we talk about personal journeys quite a bit. I know your kids are quite a few years from working age, which is great because that gives them time to make more progress. But are there things you're doing now to prepare them for the future based on how you're coaching neurodivergent adults today?
I think the biggest thing that I'm doing, and you know what, I'm probably doing a million things wrong, so I'll call that out with, as most parents probably would. But what I really want to instill in my kids is just a confidence in who they are and acceptance in who they are. A lot has changed even from when I was a kid and people were diagnosed autistic versus them being diagnosed. And I hope that it will continue to trend in the right direction. But, last month being Autism Acceptance Month, on World Autism Day, like, we had a party and they wanted to. They are excited anytime they hear about autism. My daughter has, Barbies with hearing aids, and it's become very normalized for her. Mm-hmm. And while we still try to educate her that, she needs to advocate for herself in terms of requesting accommodations or asking people to speak up, she doesn't feel any negative sort of way about wearing hearing aids. She actually thinks that they're super cool. And her brother is very jealous of her that he doesn't get to wear hearing aids and have, special equipment. So really just trying to frame to them like that they are perfect the way that they are, and that society has some barriers right now and probably will in the future. Here's how we can navigate them together. But never setting the precedent that there's something wrong with how they think or communicate, because there's not. They've taught me so much even in their short lives, and I'm able to see the world in a way that I never saw it before just because of them letting me in on that. So the main thing I would say is just empowerment and self-advocacy.
Yeah. One of the things that my kids are a little bit older than yours, and one of the things that my husband and I think about a lot is like the transition periods. So, and I think there's safe spaces, right? Like there's autism communities and your family or families like mine. But as my boys are getting older, the engagement with the outside world is becoming more apparent. So this is where that conversation, and we kind of talked about the desired future state and the reality. And now that my boys are 14 and 17, we have kind of conversations about like the difference between like our home and our like micro community versus engaging with the outside world. So I think it's one of those things that it's hard as a parent, because my kids have been fortunate, and it sounds like your children are as well, to not have really had the dissonance exposed because of their differences, and to know that that might be coming. So it's one of those things. I like how you said, like, they're empowered and they're like proud of themselves, and to like keep that energy so that they don't end up like the woman that you were working with, where she had been broken. So those are the things I think about in terms of like balancing like my micro community versus the macro world that we're working with.
Yeah, that's a good call out, because to your point, not likely, 100%, everything is not going to be fixed by the time they're ready to enter the workforce. And while it's good to have empowerment, it's also good to prepare them, just like I said with the job coaching that I do, prepare them for what they're going to encounter. And it's not all going to be, sunshine and roses. There's going to be obstacles, but preparing them and letting them know what to expect, I think, will definitely be especially important during the phases that your kids are in now, like emerging into adulthood.
Yeah, it's a whole different animal, and a great conversation for another time. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, we touched on readying employers and readying individuals. And one of the things you had talked about was how managers and implementing some of these changes improve things for others. So I like to call that readying for the guest. I think, and maybe you could talk about this briefly, I see a lot of people focused on bringing neurodiversity in, right? Like increasing the numbers of known neurodivergence in, because like you said, there's neurodiversity amongst us. We just don't always know it. But one of the things I always get concerned about is, as much as we need to bring people in, because there's talented people out there, there's a little bit of house cleaning that really needs to incur. Like, you wouldn't invite a guest into your home until you were ready. So how do we help employers get ready today so that they are ready to be neuro-inclusive tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely an order of operations. And as we all know, DEI over the last year has been facing a lot of critique. And some of it, I think, is warranted because, to your point, there has just been a focus on hiring and not supporting and building community for that talent once they're brought on. So I think that's a big learning lesson for, those in this space, myself included. But really, I think with the order of operations, it starts with education, ensuring you have an accommodations process. Do you have a candidate accommodations process? Do you have an employee accommodations process so that people can know where to get support and how to get support? Do you have, an ERG so that there's community in your company? And even if you don't have, an ERG and your company is not super advanced in that space, it's important to recognize that most of these things are free. Like 50% of employee accommodations are free. And the median cost of the remaining 50% is very low. I can't remember exactly what it is. I think it's around $500.
Yeah, it's like $500.
Yeah, sometimes like this seems like a much bigger problem than it really is. And so just even investing in, someone like myself or Disability In is a great partner to bring somebody in to educate on what neurodiversity is. What are accommodations? That's a great place to start. I think education is our biggest tool. And then from there, you can go and build out those processes. But I just want to reiterate that these things don't cost thousands and thousands of dollars. They don't even require too much effort once you get the framework in place and you start, using the practices of, for example, people adding, their pronouns to things. Mm-hmm. At first, it maybe felt a little clunky, but now people are really starting to just adopt it as a regular practice. And I think it's similar in this space.
Yeah. And I think the myth that just accommodations for disabilities cost a lot is because there was a time it did cost a lot, right? In the 1970s, employers were being asked to retrofit buildings to put in lifts and elevators that weren't there, right? So there was a huge cost to that. And then I would say maybe 15 years ago, technology wasn't what it was today, right? So you didn't have Zoom with auto captioning, and the software providers weren't integrating, right, accessibility into their software. So people had to have Dragon, or they had to have other softwares so that they could read, and screen readers. And technology, right? I think of iPhones and how integrated and disability accessible they are. Those costs aren't there anymore because they're part of the software packages we're already buying. So I think that there's like some, what do you call it, historical bleed where people are like, oh, accommodations are expensive because there was a time where they were. But the changes we're talking about is like good management practices, psychological safety, clear job expectations, notes after meetings, like, right? That's just good business practice. And so I think I like that you called it out. It doesn't cost much. It just takes a little good management skills and thoughtfulness, right, to meet people where they are.
Yeah. And what I always come back to is, have you asked someone, have you asked them how they like to communicate? Have you asked them, if they want an example or if they are understanding what you ask them to do? Because I think we often just, like you said earlier, we have this business as usual that we do, the way things have always been done. But even just stepping back and asking people if they understand, checking for understanding, checking for if, they need anything is a huge tool and a huge way to create a neuro-inclusive environment.
Yeah. And I think it makes such a big difference. I feel like our time is just flying with us today. And I just have like a few more questions that I want to ask before I let you get back to everything you have on your plate. But, when you think about the future, like, what do you really envision employment access to look like for neurodivergent individuals? What ultimately is your future state goal?
My future state goal would honestly be for my type of job and my type of programs to not even exist. because the hiring process has just become neuro-inclusive. And, there are ways for people to request accommodations and such, but we're not having to completely, redo a hiring process, rechange a whole team environment. We just start with that neuro-inclusive environment. Like you've talked about, there's phenomenon like the curb cut effect, where, if you design for people with disabilities or people who are neurodivergent, everyone benefits. Things like closed captioning, keyboards, curb cuts, which is where it got the name, were designed for people with disabilities, but everyone is like, wow, this actually makes a better environment. This is actually very useful. So if we just move towards having an inclusive design approach for our hiring programs, for our companies in general, for society, we won't even need to be, standing up these programs to try and even the playing field, because we've just created an inclusive playing field for everyone. So I envision that, and I just envision interactions for people who are neurodivergent and disabled to not be so full of stigmas, not everyone having these preconceived notions of what autism is, what an autistic person can do. We just move towards a society where we recognize everyone is different. We have a neurodiverse society full of neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, and that's a benefit. That's a competitive advantage. We're able to solve problems in new ways, view the world in new ways, and we're not talking about deficits. We're talking about, the innovation that can come with that.
And just focusing on all the possibilities. So as we work for the future state, but today we do need help, how can our listeners connect with you or learn more about your work at Divergent Talent Consulting?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's www.divergenttalentconsulting.com. And I also am pretty active on LinkedIn, do a lot of advocacy there. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I have free consultations on my website for anyone who's interested in services, whether that be a corporation looking for training or an individual who's looking for, some support in their job journey.
Thank you for sharing that with the audience. And before we conclude our time today, is there anything you want to add or a piece of advice you would give to neurodivergent individuals looking to enhance their employment process?
I think the main thing that I would say is just that I have so many job seekers, similar to the example of the woman that I gave earlier, who are feeling very disempowered, and they're feeling that it's their fault as to why job prospects aren't working out. They've been, whether it's someone who's been interviewing for roles for 3 years and has never landed something, someone who is getting jobs, but they leave after a year because they're so burnt out, or somebody in between all of that who's maybe been in their career for 15 years, but they've been masking and they've been hurting that whole time. I just want to really share that it's not you. There are significant barriers in society for people who are neurodivergent. One of the biggest being the workplace. And there's a lot of work to be done. And it's not you. We just need to find the right environment. We just need to educate companies on how to get there. But I'm here. There's a lot of great job coaches out there for neurodivergent talent that can help kind of demystify the corporate culture, the interview process, so that it doesn't have to seem like such a maze.
That is just a great way to end our time together. And I hope for those listening that you are listening and hear that you are definitely not alone. And there's an army of us out there wanting to help you. I want to thank you, Weslie, for your time and everything you're doing to help lead neurodivergent individuals on the path of success. And I want to thank everybody for continuing to support the change needed to achieve the neuro-inclusion revolution. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Work Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.